Wizards of the Coast just blew up the vintage format. Welcome back, vintage gamers. Wizards has done it. The mob has won, and the format is going to be changed forever. Probably a whole new format following this banner restricted announcement in which Urza Saga and Vexing Bauble are both being restricted in vintage. This is fairly close to a live reaction video, only a couple minutes after it's gone. So you're gonna hear my raw thoughts here on what this means for the format, how I feel about this, these restrictions, and well, just probably a little bit of rambling. So we'll see what happens. Let's just go through what they have to say, because what they have to say is important. Since the removal of Lurrus from the very selective vintage banned list in 2021, the companion has been growing part of the vintage format. As a format, vintage event tends to evolve slower and generally takes more time to see signs of maintenance needed. In fact, aside from banning sticker attractions, the last few changes made to the format involving unbannings and unrestrictions. This is a good sign that vintage has been in a good spot for some time now. I agree with that wholeheartedly. The last few years of vintage have been amazing. Lurrus decks featuring Urza Saga have had the top spot in the metagame for the past year or so. Multiple spots in tabletop events and online challenges. True. While Lurrus Saga is widely regarded as a top strategy, the opportunity cost of playing for Saga in the format is simply too low. That's totally a reasonable argument to make, especially with the addition of Lorien revealed. Urza Saga's downside in terms of putting it in your deck, in terms of deck building, fairly low since Lorien revealed was printed. The cost of it being in play, that's probably a different topic and a little bit more contentious in my opinion. But putting it in your deck, definitely not hard to do with the addition of Lorien. Nearly all decks that run a suite of artifacts that cost 0 or 1 mana, from Mishra's Workshop to Tinker decks, a number of strategies lever this powerful land without narrowing their overall game plan. All true. As a top 5 most played unrestricted card in vintage, the restriction of Urza Saga is unlikely to remove it from many strategies as currently played in, although it will happen to a degree. Yeah, this is true. I don't believe there will be any decks that currently run Urza Saga that will stop running Urza Saga. Urza Saga was never a focal point of any of these decks' game plans. It was always more of a plan B and a supporting kind of cast. And almost all of the decks that play Urza Saga can be played without Urza Saga and do well, and sometimes even benefit from having less Urza Sagas. You've seen me in recent videos cut Urza Saga from a Breach deck. My opponent didn't wasteland my red source because they were playing around Urza Saga, which let me win the game. This kind of thing happens. Fewer games will be decided by a pair of 6/6 construct tokens, a burst of Black Lotus mana on turns 3 and 4, which should lead to a diverse range of experiences for players to enjoy vintage, and for the reasons mentioned above, Urza Saga is restricted in vintage. Now, it's probably going to surprise you, but I don't think this is unreasonable. Urza Saga is an extremely powerful card. It was a card that was played in a large percentage of decks, and it was a card that lost its deck building penalty by Lorien revealed existing. I don't think, and it doesn't seem like the main argument here is Urza Saga is too good for vintage. Urza Saga was put in a bunch of decks that all were fairly reasonable win rates. Obviously, the Lurrus Saga controlling decks were the ones that were a bit of the outlier, maybe hovering, around 54% win rate on the higher end of things. However, not high enough that I would consider it to be a must ban. They were a focal point of the Jewel decks that did very well in paper. I just said focal point after I said they're not the focal point. The specific part of Jewel is that they were the plan B and a very powerful plan B to a all-in combo deck. I think this is a totally reasonable explanation on why you would restrict Urza Saga from a format, even if I wouldn't agree on if you should or should not. We'll get to that in a second. Let's keep reading through what they have to say here about Vexing Bauble. because this one was a surprise. It was a very big surprise. While we're talking about the most played unrestricted cards, let's talk about Vexing Bauble. I'm not sure I would consider Vexing Bauble one of the most played unrestricted cards. I'd have to go back and look, but it was declining extremely rapidly the last time I had checked. It obviously started out with a bang, but that's because people try new cards. This gem from Modern Horizons 3 stops people from casting various free spells in Modern, Grief, Living End, Force of Nation, which is a reasonable goal for that format, but not others. Specifically, you play Vintage to play the most powerful spells in the history of Magic. A player who goes first can resolve a Vexing Bauble and shut off your opponent's Moxen, Lotuses, and Force of Wills, which are a major reason folks are drawn to the format. Playing 2 to 4 of these, an interesting distinction, isn't a big of a hindrance to your own strategy. Not sure I agree with that. Unlike something like Chalice of the Void, as you can sacrifice extra copies, resolve more 0-mana spells, and then resolve another before passing the turn. That's like true. That's definitely a true part of it. In the spirit of keeping Vintage about Vintage, Vexing Bauble is restricted. Again, this is a reasonable reason. This is a reason you could use to justify Vexing Bauble, and I said so in my video about Vexing Bauble. It is a little suspect when cards like Void Mirror exist, but Vexing Bauble was clearly on a power level higher than Void Mirror, being a 1-mana instead of 2-mana card, and a card that sacrifices to itself. Now, it doesn't say that Vexing Bauble is being restricted on power level, and I think you would be foolish to do so because Vexing Bauble is not a powerful card in Vintage. It is just an okay card in Vintage. It is a role player, and honestly, it's a shame that it's being restricted in my mind, because the decks that want to play 4 of these are actually the decks that are struggling the most, the non-Force of Will decks. It's really going to... It's going to probably just take the card completely out of the format. With Urza's Saga being a one-of now, you can't really tutor this with any kind of consistency. Maybe people will play it because it's a restricted card, and you can, maybe you can do some one-sided Chalice type effects, but people don't even play Chalice of the Void for that. And Chalice of the Void is a much stronger Magic card than Vexing Bauble. So I would assume Vexing Bauble is basically completely taking out of the format just because it doesn't fit the philosophy of what they want people to be playing in Vintage, and I guess that's fine. Some people will certainly enjoy that. I think it's a little silly. It's just a card that is not good enough to be restricted on power level reasons. It's just kind of it's not super fun for some players. I don't know. That's not how I would like to run a ban restriction list, but I know that they do run Vintage and Legacy like that, restrictions like this. So, overall thoughts. This is fine. This is a totally reasonable set of cards to be restricted, and the reasons they gave are fine. I question whether they should be doing this. Vintage right now is in one of the best spots of any format in Magic. Any constructed format in Magic, Vintage is probably the second most balanced behind Standard, which is crazy. The format is diverse and was a lot about playing to the board, which it hasn't been in the past. And I thought, personally, and from a data's perspective, that I wouldn't want to shake things up for the sake of shaking things up, which to me is what this feels like. Urza's Saga could be restricted. Like, that's totally fine. But did it need to be? I would say almost unequivocally no. Did Vexing Bauble need to be hit? Definitely no. Vexing Bauble might be one of the weakest cards on the entirety of the Vintage restriction list now. And obviously, it wasn't stated here that it was banned for power reasons. So, something to think about. What does this do to the format? Hard to say. Really hard to say, because this, in no uncertain terms, just blows up the format. The format has been warping around the presence of Urza's Saga for a couple of years, and some people will say that's a negative. I think that was almost generally a huge positive for the format. Having people play to the board more often, win with combat damage. Urza Saga was what the format was shaping around, and now that is removed to a degree. Obviously, people will still have one Urza Saga, but Urza Saga definitely draws a lot of its power from having multiple copies. That's almost certainly true. And it does just dismantle part of the idea of the best deck in the format, but not the entirety of the idea of the best deck in the format. And that is something to be concerned about. There's a way you can look at this as a significant buff to the current best deck in the format, known as Lurrus Saga. Now will definitely not be known as Lurrus Saga. But these decks were already struggling to cast the very powerful Psychic Frog with their Urza Saga lands. And whenever I tested this deck, I was almost always upset that my lands were not islands to cast Frog instead of playing a Saga, which could be easily dealt with. Now, maybe the format changes and Frog can be easily dealt with. That's totally possible. But do I think this is going to kill the best deck in the format? No. I think you could even say this might buff the best deck in the format. And the best deck in the format, in my mind, is a blue-black-based Lurrus control deck using the power of Wasteland. I'm a little scared about that, honestly. I'm honestly a little scared about that. I personally believe that Wasteland is stronger than Urza Saga. Obviously, it doesn't make constructs and kill you. It doesn't find Time Vault and kill you. But it takes away your mana, and a lot of times that is killing you. I don't think Wasteland disappears. Some people have been saying, oh, but without the need to Wasteland Urza Saga, it goes away. No, these blue-black decks are going to continue to play Wasteland. They are going to still need to kill Bazaar of Baghdad, and they still want to kill... they want to take you off mana and tempo you with a Psychic Frog. Wasteland is not going away. In fact, Wasteland might be even more dominant after this. That one... probably more of a suspect thing, but it's a possibility. I'm just going to give you a bunch of possibilities here because it actually is extremely hard to know where the metagame is going to go after this. It could completely change. Maybe it doesn't. So let's just continue talking about how the removal of Saga. I don't even know if I'm going to talk about the removal of Bauble because I don't actually believe the removal of Bauble changes almost anything about Vintage. It's just very silly, but we'll continue going down. Let's start at the top then. Shops decks. Shops decks lose a tool. They lose a tool here that was helping them reclaim their place in the metagame. Shops were having a bit of a resurgence because sphere-based workshops were doing a very good job of battling into Blue-Black Lurrus Saga, and now they have lost a tool to beat control decks with 4 Sagas. They will still have 1 Saga. They could maybe search it off Golos still. So... there's some power there, but they've lost some amount of uncounterable inevitability in terms of, a spell that gets put on the stack, uncounterable. But obviously you can answer a Saga in play with a variety of things. So yeah, a nerf for sure to sphere-based shops decks. I guess theoretically a Vexing Bauble restriction is a nerf to jewel-based shops decks because those decks were playing 2 Vexing Baubles sometimes. I don't know if they were supposed to or if they were, going to end up going down to 0. Obviously, they started on 4 and they just kept cutting it and kept cutting it. And at some point, I feel like it might have gone down to 1 or 0, but maybe it's a little hard to say. That card's a little bit contentious inside of the Sphere deck because it doesn't synergize very well with the Sphere plan. I don't think the Bauble restriction matters very much for Sphere shops, but Saga restriction definitely does. Jewel shops. Now, this will be a very interesting one to watch because the Jewel engine is still intact. It is still a super broken blue workshop combo deck. However, it is drastically losing its plan B, which gave it game against Null Rod sometimes. Sometimes gave it game against Null Rod. You know how I say most of the time your Null Rod will beat Jewel. The times that your Null Rod does not beat Jewel were Urza Saga games, combined with like Tolarian Academy or Ancient Tomb, those kind of things. So the fact that it loses 3 Sagas for its backup plan is significant, and I think will legitimately hurt the Jewel deck, but the Jewel deck already wasn't doing super amazing, very counterable deck, so... And I also think the Jewel deck is a heinous deck to have in the format, so I'm okay with a little bit of a Jewel nerf. It will be interesting to see what Jewel players do. Will they keep playing the deck? Will they move to a different combo deck? There are just some combo decks here that are going to love the fact that Saga is a 1-of. So it'll be interesting to see what Jewel players do. That being said, I don't think you're allowed to take your Null Rods away yet. I think you still need your Null Rod effects to battle Jewel. Like this The turn 1 ring and turn 1 jewels are still alive, but hopefully it will be turned down a little bit. I think that's maybe the thing I'm the most happy about an Urza Saga restriction is a weakening of jewels backup plan. So that makes me pretty happy. Oh, I think a train went by or something. Crazy. Anyways, I'm not editing this. We're just spewing for the next half hour or so. Bazaar. Oh, Bazaar. Bazaar. It's really weird because people were saying, oh, Bazaar is dead, but Dredge is one of the most effective decks in the current metagame. Dredge players have told me that Saga was not an incredible issue. It will kind of come down for Dredge players to will Wasteland be will Wasteland's meta size shrink? And I can't see a reason why Wasteland's meta size would. None of the decks that currently play Wasteland are going to stop playing Wasteland because Urza Saga doesn't exist as the 4 of. Like, all these decks are going to continue to play 5 Wastelands. So the problem inherent in Bazaar right now is Wasteland, and I don't believe that restricting Saga makes a change there. That being said, Dredge is already a good deck in the format. 52% win rate last weekend. It was a 10% play rate, 52% win rate, putting it at the 4th most played, 5th most played deck. So, like, it's not like Bazaar was actually dead. People were just complaining because Bazaar wasn't broken. That being said, Agrovine and Countervine were both dead. Completely true statement. These decks were seeing no play. Vexing Bauble was a tack-on problem, as was Urza Saga to some degree for the Vine decks. This should be a buff to Vine decks. We may see a resurgence in Vine decks, especially if other decks that aren't Urza Saga enabled, like Doomsday. If we see a resurgence in Doomsday and decks that want to beat Doomsday, then maybe we see Vine come back. I am hesitant to say that this makes Vine decks good again. I kind of hope it doesn't. I don't really think that Countervine is a very fun deck to exist in the format as a predominant metagame feature. I think it's a fine deck to exist. It's nice when you can choose between the 3 different distinct Bazaar decks. I thought that was actually a really cool feature. Because if Bazaar has to exist in the format because it's a pillar of the format, then it's nice to have actual options inside of the Bazaar, distinct Bazaar decks. So I think this might help that. It's possible. I think people will definitely try to play Countervine again. I don't even think Countervine should have been 0 play rate as it is, but I understand why it was 0 play rate. And the Vexing Bauble restriction definitely helps Countervine because people just won't be playing Vexing Baubles. Like, regardless of the fact of is Bauble good or is Bauble bad, people were playing Bauble, and thus the Countervine deck was adversely affected, right? So that'll be interesting to watch. Will Vine make a comeback? Luris Saga. Oh my god, I just read Luris Saga had a 18% play rate and a 48% win rate last weekend. Oh man. So maybe Saga was already on the downturn inside of Control. I'm not sure that's actually true. Probably just one bad weekend, all things considered, but kind of a funny little thing to look at. I don't think, like I said, I don't think Wasteland-based control, Luris-based control is going away. If anything, I think this doesn't actually hurt that deck too much. Obviously, Saga was a predominant feature inside of the deck and a strong point of the deck, and this will push those decks away from the Time Vault key plan, which might make them more easy to interact with. So we'll have to see how that fallout goes. Doomsday, this is just I'm not even sure this is a direct buff to Doomsday. People are saying Doomsday will be really good with this change, but I'm not actually sure that's true. Urza Saga was a nice flash, end of turn flash style threat against Doomsday where you could hold open counter magic and still make a construct to attack. Vexing Bauble didn't affect Doomsday. Vexing Bauble was not very good against Doomsday. Obviously, it stopped some of Doomsday's power in terms of speed, but it was really just kind of a road bump. And also, whenever I was playing Doomsday, I was like letting the Vexing Baubles resolve because my opponent couldn't cast Force of Will. I could just cast all the spells I wanted, that kind of thing. The reason I'm not sure that Urza Saga restriction affects Doomsday in a positive way is because people are going to be playing more like blue-based stuff Like, and then Vine might come back. Flusterstorm might come back. Flusterstorm was at an all-time low in the metagame. I don't think Doomsday is an unbeatable deck by a blue deck who wants to beat it, but it does require certain tools. And I'm not sure if the meta... I really just don't know if the metagame will shift towards a place where the tools that are good against Doomsday are good or not. It all really depends on what the fallout in terms of metagame percentages is. So that'll be interesting. Turbo Vault Key will be pretty much dead in its current iteration. You could totally build a Turbo Vault Key deck without Saga, but it definitely loses some of its power. Maybe that pushes it back towards... I'm not actually sure. Breach could be. Hard to say. Bug. I would assume Bug is unhappy to see a Urza Saga restriction just because it's the kind of card that Bug really preyed upon. Bug had all these nice ways to remove that card, restrict its mana with Collector Roof and that kind of thing. I think Bug is probably unhappy to see a metagame shift in this way. However, if Bazaar makes a very large comeback, then Bug might not be super unhappy. Initiative. I actually think this is a buff to Initiative. Is that possible? So, Vexing Bauble was a good card in Initiative. Urza Saga was a good card against Initiative. But I actually think Vexing Bauble did some weird things with Initiative where it was having Initiative players keep hands that weren't really emphasizing the deck's game plan. Like, if you're keeping Plains Bauble go instead of trying to, like, play a turn 1 Arcana of Emeria, I'm not sure that's, like, what your deck wants to be doing. I would go on a limb and say it's probably... I think the deck's going to be fine. The deck wasn't... in my opinion, the deck wasn't particularly good. Even with Bauble, it was, last weekend, as an example, last weekend, 21 people played Initiative, 12% on the metagame at a 45% win rate. Initiative is a deck that people turn to, but I'm not 100% sure it's always good. It's definitely a deck that gets better when people play less removal spells. I don't really see any reason why people would play less removal spells now. It'll be interesting to keep an eye on it, how this would affect Initiative. Technically, theoretically speaking, a Saga restriction and a Vexing Bauble restriction are both a buff and a nerf to Initiative. But I'm not 100% sure the Vexing Bauble restriction matters. I don't even know if Initiative will play the first Bauble anymore. Like, they don't always play the first Chalice, right? So, like, Bauble, like I said, this is what I'm saying. Bauble is probably just completely gone from the format, which some people will like because they don't want to play against Bauble. I mean, it's certainly annoying for me to play my Moxen combo decks against Bauble, but I don't know. Sometimes I think there should be some downside to having a hand of Black Lotus all Moxen brokenness, right? I don't know. Hard to say. Oath of Druids. That's an interesting one to think about. Does this matter for Oath? It's weird because Saga could get Cage, but I didn't even find Cage to be that good against the show and tell Oath decks. And all of the Urza's Saga control decks were good matchups for Oath, where Jewel was a bad matchup for Oath. I'm not sure how this pans out in terms of Oath. I'd have to think on that one more. And then Tinker. Does this help PO, Grixis Saga, Esper Saga, Initiative Tinker, Blue Ring Tinker? No? Probably not. It does likely mean if you want to play a big artifact combo deck, you would play Tinker over Luris because I think Vexing Bauble really helped prop up Luris in terms of artifact combo. Not Vexing Bauble. Urza Saga propped up Luris in terms of artifact combo. But the thing is, I still think there'll be a Luris Saga control deck that just one Bauble, or sorry, I keep doing that. One Saga, 4 Wasteland, 1 Strip Mine, and it's very much the same deck, and it's still going to be very good. So it's a little hard to say. I would say it's probably a nerf. Like, Saga giving these Tinker decks an additional powerful outlet was definitely a buff, especially after Lorien Revealed was printed. You'll definitely remember me saying I didn't like Saga in PO in the beginning, But once Lorien Revealed was printed, that changed things for sure. These decks will all still play, all these Tinker decks will still play one Saga, especially because you can Demonic Tutor and Vampiric Tutor for it, especially when, like, a really nice line of thinking, and a play that you would make a lot of the time is if your opponent has a suite of counter magic in hand and you end of turn Vampiric Tutor, sometimes you could just go get a Saga because it's a threat, that's a land that won't get beat by a bunch of counters. And that will still exist as a one of, so. Yeah. That's the whole metagame. The problem is with all of those thoughts is we just don't know what the field will shape out to be. Will a Lurrus Frog Wasteland deck just continue to be the center of the metagame and everything else is just shifting around that? In which case, the format doesn't really change that much and is just shaken up a little bit. Or do some of these decks get a big buff? It's really hard to say. This is, like I said, this is a complete change to what Vintage is based around. So it'll be very interesting to see going forward. I want to make a statement here and say there's a chance this is bad. I said these are fine and reasonable reasons to restrict cards, and it's not an unreasonable line to go down. But there's a chance this ends poorly. There's a chance we come out on the other side of this and Vintage is in a worse spot than it was before. And I just think we should probably be cognizant and aware of that possibility happening. In my opinion, Urza Saga was a catalyst to what created one of the most balanced and diverse Vintage formats over the past 2 years, which resulted in one of the balanced and diverse formats in all time for Vintage. Statistically, like using, Menendian's, I forget what that thing was called, some kind of index. This has been one of the most balanced and diverse Vintage formats of all time, and we are shaking it up, and we do not know if the grass will be greener on the other side. For me personally, it's gonna be fun. I have the opportunity to make a bunch of brand new content in a new metagame. As a content creator, this kind of shake up for the sake of shaking things up is always going to result in more things to try out and more content to be made. So good for me and good for my viewers, but will it be good for the Vintage format? Time will tell. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Obviously, a lot of people are happy to see Saga restricted. They think it's been around for too long. They don't really like that it takes away the spotlight from the older cards in Vintage. And a lot of old heads are also happy to see Bauble restricted because they want to just play their broken turn Moxen on turn 1. So even if I'm not enthusiastic about it, I know a lot of people will be, and I'm happy for those people. And we'll see what we can do in the upcoming Vintage videos, Monday, Wednesdays, and Friday on this channel. We will have a couple rounds of pre-loaded videos before new content comes out. I am going into surgery on Wednesday, so I have videos all the way up until next Monday of the old format. Some of them are not particularly thrilling. I get my butt kicked in some of them, but I also have a 5-0 in there, and some really just powerful magic, so hopefully you will enjoy that, and new Vintage content coming soon. See you then.